This morning, we are going to continue on in our new Advent series, adding part number 2 entitled Enough, Recognizing Provision and How Anxiety Rooted in Scarcity Leads to Greed. Now, last week, we set things up by talking about the season of Advent as an act of defiance. It's our refusal to participate in the anxiety that you don't have enough, especially in a season of excess. And then we also talked about how your quality of life improves not by gaining, not by collecting, not by hoarding, but actually by giving the best of yourself away. It is scientifically proven that your life gets better if you help the lives of others get better. And then we tied everything up by talking about Jesus, the coming King, and how he frees us from the pursuit of happiness. Because happiness is only happiness if everything is perfect. And we all know that nothing is ever totally perfect. So instead, you and I, in the season and as disciples of Jesus, we are invited to rejoice in spite of, or in the middle of imperfection, because we know where God is ultimately taking this world. And that's where I'd like for us to pick up this morning. This week, I want to expand on that idea of having enough. I want to take it a little step further, and I want us to explore the feelings or even the reality of not having enough of God. So this morning, we're going to spend some time talking about what to make of God's silence. And then we're going to talk a little bit about how to cope with life when God appears to be absent. And then finally, why God doesn't save us from our brokenness, but actually in our brokenness. So all of that and more, let's kick off with Habakkuk one more time. He says this. He says, "How long, Lord, must I call for help, but you do not listen, or cry out to you, violence, but you do not save? Why do you make me look at injustice? Why do you tolerate wrongdoing? Destruction and violence are before me. There is strife and conflict abounds. Therefore, the law is paralyzed and justice never prevails. The wicked hem in the righteous so that justice is perverted." Now, we've all felt a measure of that before, haven't we? And maybe some of us have been so bold, like Habakkuk, to actually question God and to say things like, "What is taking so long? Are you going to say anything, God? Are you going to do anything, God? Is this for real, God? Is this a joke?" And if you've ever felt that way, if you've ever directed your complaints towards God when there's been some part of your life that's off the rails, then I need you to know this morning that you're actually in good company. Because you see, the silence of God is a major theme throughout the scriptures, and it is a significant part of the Christian life. And Habakkuk's questions ought to be included in every believer's struggle for faith. Now, I grew up saying, don't question God, don't ask, don't push back, don't be honest, don't be real, just hold some of that stuff back. But you need to know this morning that that's not the way it works. That not only are questions like this okay, but they are actually necessary for the development and the health of our faith. Now, in Habakkuk's situation, he is bewildered, because it seems like God has checked out. And the context for his frustration actually justifies his complaint. Here's what's going on. He's living during a time of widespread oppression, injustice, and violence. Not only that, for those who were actually loyal to God during this tough time, those who were in power continued to crush them and beat them down. And to add insult to injury, for those who refused to participate in the unjust and illegal practices of Habakkuk's society, those people actually became objects of mistreatment. So it was a damned if you do or damned if you don't scenario. And so Habakkuk laments. How long, God? How long? How much longer must we put up with disappointment? How much longer should we keep our hopes up? How much longer is it going to take for you to act? And for some of us, those questions and those feelings are awfully familiar, because it feels like all we ever do is wait for something good to happen. And sometimes all that waiting feels a little bit like this. Sometimes it feels like we're just on the edge of our seats in full expectation for something to happen, only to be disappointed. Sometimes we wait because it seems like things are going to land and line up just perfectly, and then they don't. Sometimes we can't help but overhear that others claim to have experienced what we are looking for, what we need, but it never seems to happen when we're in the room. It never seems to happen for us. And so we wait. And in our waiting, when things are not okay, we are justified in asking God, how long? So if that's you this morning, if that is how you feel, if that's where you find yourself, allow me to offer you this encouragement. That it's okay to be upset when things are not okay. And that feeling that you have inside of you, that yearning for things to be made right, God feels that same thing. In fact, I would argue that He's the one who planted that seed inside of you. So pay attention to that. That is telling you something. That is shaping you. So if you're here this morning and you're experiencing or witnessing some type of injustice, if you're in a spot where things just aren't right, and there are things that are happening that go against God and go against His intentions and go against His character, if you're in that damned if you do and damned if you don't situation like Habakkuk, if you're doing everything right and waiting so patiently and you're so good and still things are missing, then my challenge to you would be to tell God about it. Be free, be open, no holds barred, let loose, no filters, be real. Because that kind of talk, those kinds of prayers do not scare God away. In fact, they're endearing to God, because in that moment, God is actually getting the real you. Which might be great for God, but it doesn't necessarily get Him off the hook for appearing to be MIA. And so the prophet Isaiah is going to help us sort that out. I'm going to read you a few verses now from chapter 45 of Isaiah. And there's a couple of voices here, and this first voice in the section I'm reading is the voice of the Lord, and it goes like this: that I will go before you and will level the mountains. I will break down gates of bronze and cut through bars of iron. I will give you hidden treasures, riches stored in secret places, so that you may know that I am the Lord, the God of Israel, who summons you by name. For the sake of Jacob, my servant, of Israel, my chosen, I summon you by name and bestow on you a title of honor, though you do not acknowledge me. I am the Lord, and there is no other. Apart from me, there is no God. I will strengthen you, though you have not acknowledged me, so that from the rising of the sun to the place of its setting, people may know there is none besides me. I am the Lord, and there is no other. I form light and create darkness. I bring prosperity and create disaster. I, the Lord, do all these things. Now press pause. So the verses roll like this in chapter 45, and it goes on and on and on. Big, bodacious stories, questions, things about God. And then it seems like for a moment, the Lord takes a breath, stops, catches breath, and Isaiah just slips in a word edgewise. Just sneaks it in verse 15, and he says this: truly you are a God who has been hiding Himself, the God and Savior of Israel. And then praises continue. Turn to me and be saved, all you ends of the earth, for I am God and there is no other. By myself I have sworn, my mouth has uttered in all integrity a word that will not be revoked. Before me every knee will bow, by me every tongue will swear, and they will say of me, in the Lord alone are deliverance and strength. That's weird, right? Just a little bit. Jammed in here between all these big verses of praise and power and the purposes of God, Isaiah gets a little word in, and it feels counterintuitive. It almost seems a little blasphemous. Either way, it feels like it doesn't quite fit in these set of verses. Or does it? Because you see, Isaiah is writing all this good stuff. You need to know, I read from chapter 45, just a few verses, but from chapter 40 to 55 in Isaiah, that's the longest stretch, the longest sustained hymn of praise in the entire scriptures. And what makes it even more insane is that when Isaiah was writing that hymn of praise, he was in a situation where everything was hopeless. Israel had been dragged into Babylonian captivity. They were being forced to assimilate and to ponder the idea and possible fact that it felt like God had abandoned them. So what seems like an audacious little verse in the midst of a bunch of praise that's actually in the middle of a big, huge mess might actually be an act of holy rebellion in the face of his oppressors, with his people far away from where they want to be, in conditions that were far from ideal. Isaiah is saying that God is even here, but for now, he's working behind the scenes. And you can tell by just how bad everything is. Now, track with me on this. This is actually a thread that runs through centuries of discussion on the silence and hiddenness of God. And the big idea is this, that anyone who has ever received a tiny glimpse of God's majesty, a tiny glimpse of his holiness and righteousness, will have an increased sense of the darkness and disorder that is in this world. It wakes us up to it. It makes us aware. It makes us aware of these forces that would swallow us up had God not set in motion a plan to reclaim his creation. And that is what Isaiah is celebrating with that little verse that he's hiding in there. And practically speaking for us, we can think about it like this. That presence and absence is the theme of God's self-disclosure. God isn't hidden because we are too stupid to find him or too lazy or not spiritual enough. God hides himself for his own reasons, and he reveals himself for his own reasons. If that were not so, God would not be God. God would be nothing more than a projection of our own religious ideas and wishes. Which means God works in the ways that God works, not in the ways that we think he should work. That means that God shows up the way that God shows up, not necessarily in the ways that we think God should show up. And if it feels like darkness is bearing down on you, that there isn't enough God to go around, it's because you actually know who God is, even if God appears to be absent. It's because you recognize the darkness because you are familiar with the light. And if that sounds like a paradox, it is. But Isaiah says to you and I this morning, deal with it. Because sometimes the things we understand about God and the things we don't understand about God need to be held in tension. And the truth that presents itself for us this morning is this, is that sometimes God works behind the scenes. And you know that distance, you know what it feels like because you know what nearness feels like. And if that's you today, if it feels like in your life that God is either silent or hidden or absent, if you really wish there was something tangible that you could grab onto, but that's just not the season that you find yourself in, allow me to give you this encouragement this morning. That this whole world and our universe and every expanding universe beyond our own is inside of God. There is nowhere that you can be that God is not, whether you feel him or know his presence is there or not. So then perhaps, like Isaiah, your brazen act of holy rebellion would be to sing God's praises with your life, even now. Even when you feel alone. Even when you're not where you want to be. Even when God is working behind the scenes and you wish he was standing center stage. And I know all of that sounds like a tall order because it is. But I have one more encouragement for you. You don't need to be afraid. In the 6th month of Elizabeth's pregnancy, God sent the angel Gabriel to the Galilean village of Nazareth to a virgin engaged to be married to a man descended from David. His name was Joseph, and the virgin's name Mary. And upon entering, Gabriel greeted her, "Good morning. You're beautiful with God's beauty. Beautiful inside and out. God be with you." And she was thoroughly shaken, wondering what was behind a greeting like that. But the angel assured her, "Mary, you have nothing to fear. God has a surprise for you. You will become pregnant and give birth to a son and call his name Jesus. And he will be great, be called Son of the Highest. The Lord God will give him the throne of his father David. He will rule Jacob's house forever, no end ever to his kingdom." You have nothing to fear, says the angel to Mary. Don't be afraid. You're just going to give birth to God. No big deal. No pressure. We'll get you some formula. It's kind of weird, right? No, we don't have too many details about Mary's pregnancy. But I'm sure in the 9-month time span between when the angel visited her and they made that mad dash to Bethlehem, that 9 months probably felt like forever. All that waiting. And yet the angel tells her, you don't need to be afraid. Now, waiting is hard enough on its own, and even more difficult when we feel fearful, right? And we get that way. When you mix waiting with fear, that is not a good combination, because all of a sudden our minds start to play tricks and tell stories and just stir up fears about other people and situations, fear about the future, fear about the unknown, and that has undeniable effects on us. So much so that the people who live in a world of fear are more likely to make aggressive, hostile, destructive responses than people who are not so frightened. The more afraid we are, the harder waiting becomes. Now, fearful people have a hard time waiting. And when we are afraid, all we really want to do is escape. Just get out of Dodge. Just calculate our losses, cut them, and move on so we can hurry up and just get to the next thing. And then when we let that fear take over, when we let that idea that the grass is greener somewhere else or that God is active everywhere else except for where we are, then we are at risk of missing out what God is already doing exactly where we are, because Jesus comes to us in the brokenness of our health, in the shipwreck of our families, in the loss of all possible peace of mind, even in the very thick of our sins. He saves us in our disasters, not from them. He emphatically does not promise to meet only the odd winner of the self-improvement lottery. He meets us all in our endless and inescapable losing. So what that might mean for us this morning is this. Maybe all you have to do in this Advent season is wait, is dare to stay. Dare to be open to the possibilities that come with waiting. Dare to pay attention to what God is doing, to what God is actually saying in the waiting. And we do that by not being afraid, because God saves us in our brokenness. God meets you and I and this world exactly where we are, because there's no other place that we could be. And this is the way that God always works. And for us this morning, that might actually shed a little bit more light onto the beauty of the incarnation. That the improbable circumstances in which Jesus first came were enough for him to save the world. Which means that who you are and the condition your life is in is enough for Jesus to show up yet again and to continue the good work that he has begun in you.